Hi Sheila, how are you?
Hi, Ed. How are you? How's it
Good. Is
going?
my sound coming through okay?
Everything sounds good. Yeah.
It's going well,
How
thank
about
you.
you? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine, thanks.
Okay, good. Awesome. Well, just waiting for all these folks to come in. We're so excited to have you. This is really a pleasure. And I genuinely, I have like literally my pen in hand to start taking notes because opportunities like this to chat with you for 30 minutes straight don't come very often. So I'm going to take full advantage of it.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
I am too. I'm really happy to have you also. What I think most people keep asking me is what's the difference? It's like, first, we're going to start with like very basic questions. What is the
Hmm.
difference here between sociology and psychology? That is like question number one. Every
Okay,
time I
we can
tell
do
people
that.
my major is sociology, but before you answer that, I keep forgetting to do this. Hi, everybody. I'm Sheila Morovati. I'm the founder of Habits of Waste. My guest today is the Vice Chair of Sociology at UCLA, Dr. Edward Walker. We're so excited to have you. So now that we have that formal introduction done, please go ahead and answer the question, which everyone asks me, what does sociology mean? Is it like psychology? What's the difference?
Hmm.
So just simple beginning of everything.
Sure. Well, I mean, psychologists and sociologists do study some of the same things. I mean, social psychology is an area that kind of bridges the two. But I would say, sociology is interested in the kind of institutions and processes that go beyond our individual psychology, that make us think about the way that our lives are shaped in all kinds of invisible ways that are not always super easily apparent to us. You could see all kinds of different inequalities by race, by class, by gender, by sexuality. Those things aren't always super apparent to everyone in their immediate day-to-day life. And what sociologists can do is show how a lot of those large-scale institutional processes affect the way that we see ourselves and the way that we live our lives.
So it's basically the behavior of society as a whole, like mass numbers of people and how they shift through the world. And the nuances, I think, are really interesting, especially for me. And what I do is those like, how do we even not notice the things that are normal per se? And I know that normal is a concept in sociology that's really has been brought up over and over
Right.
again, that there's really no such thing as normal. Can you touch on that just for a little bit?
Hmm.
Is the concept
Well,
of
sure. I
normal
mean, the
even
very
like,
definition of
does
what
it
is
even belong in
normal.
our
Yeah.
dialogue? Sorry, can you just repeat
Well,
that one more time?
I think a lot of sociologists will point out that it's a socially constructed, kind of situation where, the very idea of what's normal is shaped by the way that we observe things through things like surveys, through things like in-person observations. So, you could think about all kinds of different ways that we tend to construct these things. There's a great book called The Averaged American by a historian, actually, that talks about how a lot of the ways that sociologists define things through their research became the way that people understood things in their everyday lives. The 1 in 10 statistic from the Kinsey reports, I mean, that came to shape a lot of people's sort of sexual identities. And it wasn't until after that study that we had that understanding of things. Of course, that's been updated and corrected in a lot of ways in the years and since. But one way or another, a lot of the time, the way that we study things become the way that people start to see their own social world, and there's always that back and forth interaction.
It's so fascinating to me. My first sociology class, I started to really understand that the way in which we go throughout our day, there's so much more kind of happening in our minds and in our daily interactions than we really even realize. And I think given the fact that it's Earth Week and the fact that we're going to be talking a little bit about the environment and how the
Hmm.
world around us is basically kind of we have to manipulate a little bit more what's normal again and how much we have to go through these obstacles to be cleaner, be greener, be all of that. And the waste related practices are something that I really want to touch on. And what
Hmm.
is a recipe for a successful social movement to address those issues? I know we've talked a lot in the past about, top down and bottom up. Could you share a little bit about what you've experienced in a
Sure.
successful social movement to make change, especially related to the environment?
Well, I've got a handy little acronym here that I wrote backwards, which I think should show up correctly. COPA. It either looks like it was written by a 2-year-old or by a psychopath, since I had to write it backwards to get it to show up here. In any case, what it stands for is, communication, organization, authenticity, right? And I see those as the 4 parts of a recipe for successful social change. Communication. How can you get your message across to people such that it will connect with them in their everyday lives and their personal experiences? If you're trying to organize for environmental justice, you could point to the local contaminants that are around. You can point to the experiences that many families might be witnessing, right? They might have unexplained headaches or nosebleeds. They don't really know where it's coming from. And if a social movement can come along and help them to understand and package that experience and turn it into something that they can organize around, that's a really important thing. Some will say that it's really all about the message, and that if you've got the message, that the rest of the things come together. I've never really been an advocate of that belief. I think that you can't just have a good message. You need to have a message tied to organization. And so that's where the O in this comes in. It's communication, then organization. How do you mobilize the people that you need to? Can you build organizing structures that don't just get them to turn out at short-term events, right? We usually call this mobilizing. How many people can you get to come out to the protest or send a letter to the member of Congress? That matters, but I think sometimes organizers chase that like a sugar high. It's like, wow, look how many people we turned out. But one of the bigger factors that can matter is not just did you mobilize them, but did you organize them, right? Did you build a long-term structure that can help people to have a durable influence on their communities and on politics? And if you could tie that to a message in the communication piece, that's really important too. I'll just say a little bit about the other two. Power, right? You need to do a really sophisticated analysis to understand where the power structures are. What kind of institutional changes are possible? Where might you try, but you're just going to spin your wheels and get nowhere? If you can know that in advance, you can save a lot of effort and actually put your organization, your communication to much better use. I could say a lot more about the power piece and come back to that because I know that's an interest of yours, Sheila. But
is that
the last
where
one
you'd
is,
say like the politicians come into play and really just
absolutely.
like getting into the legislation as well as all the movement from the ground up? Is that
Yeah,
where
I
you
think there's
put
a
power?
lesson that, anyone who's a parent knows the experience of how a child will play one parent against the other, right? They say, well, dad said you could do this, but mom said you couldn't, right? And that's a way of dividing the elite in that family, right? The people who control the power and resources. And so what you need to do is figure out, like, is there a divided elite? Are there people that you can play against one another? Some might be allied with you, some might be opposed. Can you find some way of using the power of those allies to your advantage? Divided elite is one. Can you find ways to work with public opinion? Are there parts of the society that might be sympathetic to you that you haven't been able to mobilize yet? That's a great way to think about it too. And just to come back to the last point, the A in the COPA is authenticity, which is something that I've been studying a whole lot lately, where you could think about an authentic social movement as somewhere where people are really walking the talk, right? The people who are involved in it, they really seem like they've got a meaningful and sincere connection to it. You can contrast that with inauthentic participation, right? And this is a lot of what I've studied, so-called Astroturf campaigns, right, that look just like grassroots citizens' participation, but are entirely created by a lobbyist or by someone connected with a major corporation. There's been a big discussion about this over the last week with these COVID-19 protests to reopen the states, where there's been all this discussion about, who's funding these movements, where's that support coming from, and it turns out that there's all these donors and well-connected kind of elites who have been helping to stir those social movements. That's raised a lot of questions about the authenticity of those protests. And authenticity, I think, is one of those other pieces where you can have communication, you can have organization, you can have power, but if it seems like people are insincere or inauthentic in their participation, it might not work to the movement's advantage. Excuse me.
That is so fascinating because I think one of the reasons why I think we've been successful at Habits of Waste is because we truly lead with our hearts, and we are trying our best to do what we want to do because we believe in it, and we're trying so hard to like fight for whatever it is, because it's like it hurts. Honestly, it hurts inside to see what happens to the planet, to the environment, to all around us. So we try our best, and I think that people have responded to us and said, it feels so authentic. It feels so authentic. And I think I always wondered about that, thinking to myself, well, how could you even begin to start a nonprofit or start a social movement if you don't care or truly care? And I guess what you just described is exactly that there are social movements, which I didn't even know, that are run by people or, with ulterior motives and all that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and it's not just about like how do you organize people, because you could be really well organized, but maybe you don't have the sort of authenticity and buy-in where people really feel like they have a meaningful connection to it. It also means policymakers can, I think, a bit more easily discredit the things that they don't, that they see on that side if there's not a lot of sort of authenticity, or if it becomes clear that that the people involved are being entirely funded from the outside. I mean, someone in the comments brought up the point about climate denial movements, and there's been a lot of research on this. And unfortunately, there are of course going to be sympathetic policymakers and they can say, well, we don't know where the funding came from, so we're just going to go along with it. So the fact that we don't have a really robust to tell where a lot of this activism comes from.
If anybody has any questions, please chime in. I'll make sure that we ask Dr. Walker your questions as well. I obviously have a million questions, so I could keep going, but I want to make sure that people know that we can also, jump in and ask questions too, please. One of the things that I learned and what inspired me to begin my work was actually a story about the Ataturk Empire in Turkey and how the grassroots movements really brought down this massive, corruption. And when I heard that story, I was thinking to myself, like, if they can do that, then we can ban straws, or that we can, eliminate single-use plastics as best we can. Massive things have happened throughout history from just regular people. Who can start a social movement other than, having a nonprofit or something like that? Could you share a little bit about that, please?
Well, I think anyone can. I think it's really a matter of finding a way to connect with people meaningfully in their communities. And oftentimes it means using, since the organization piece, that second part that I talked about, is so important, a lot of times you have to work with the existing building blocks in a community, right? How are people connected together? This is part of why a lot of groups build on religious faiths, right? Faith traditions, because people are already organized together in congregations, right? They have strong beliefs that are often tied to this. Community organizations, recreational groups. Part of the reason why a lot of activism comes from students is not just because young people, are a little bit more willing to do things that might involve a little bit of risk, but it's because they're connected together in schools, right? I mean, a lot of course, the fundamental Southern civil rights movement was deeply rooted in the African American church, right? But then there was also, some outside support that came from white Northern students who were connected to the universities, who went south to help voter registration drives. So I think it's really interesting to think about, you need to build from a lot of the existing organizational building blocks, right? Find a way to use those and build from them and make them more substantial. This is part of why, if you don't have that authentic connection, it can be difficult, right? Because it'll look like, well, you're just kind of parachuting into some community or parachuting in on some topic, and you don't have a long-term kind of in-depth way of making a difference. But one of the other pieces that I think is really important here is that I think there's a tendency that a lot of people have to think about it in terms of individual change, and this is so important in the politics of climate, rather than institutional change, where we often will talk about it, well, if people just decided to voluntarily on their own just take fewer flights in a given year, maybe they would just decide to, to consume a little bit less. Everyone's got their favorite example of like, oh, we just take our tote bags to the grocery store and now we're good.
Right.
And, of course, the work that your organization is doing is so important because you're pushing for not just the individual changes, but the big institutional changes, right? So you want people to use less plasticware, like, yeah, get Uber Eats and Postmates to stop putting those in by default, You want to change people's, willingness to go on a flight, like have a carbon tax, These are the kinds of things that are big institutional changes that once they start, they can snowball. They can get bigger and bigger. And I think that can give organizers who want to make change on these things even more leverage than they had before. One of my favorite examples of this is the Americans with Disabilities Act. There was a pretty substantial disability rights movement before the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in the early 90s, but it was really after the ADA passed that you saw this major expansion of disability access. And now, people had things to organize around. Is your building ADA compliant? Are the sidewalks, compliant such that people who use wheelchairs can get around? Think about how those institutional changes, we like to see them usually as endpoints, but a lot of times they're really starting points, and they can become ways that people can organize that much more. I mean, think about how much more health organizing started to happen after the Affordable Care Act passed. It becomes a moment of leverage, for people to do even that much more organizing around.
Absolutely, and it also brings the awareness to the forefront of the mindset of the individual, and that's the other thing. It's like sometimes you just need a megaphone to put out there what, you know, bring up those nuances that we don't notice on daily life, and suddenly it's like they're shouting in your face, "Did you not notice this?" And then people say, "Oh, I don't know why I didn't think of that," because it's so normal. And again, I use that word in quotes because normal really is a construct, but I think that that's kind of what the fight is right now, to get people to wake up and see what's happening around them, especially with the environment. On that note, I wanted to ask a question, and then we have a student who asked a question that I want to ask you as well. But the one thing I constantly see, like these social media memes and these posts, and it says, "Oh, I'm just one person," said, you know, 8 billion people. "Oh, it's just one water bottle. Oh, it's just one straw." How come the individual behaves like that, but mass society behaves in a completely different way? How do you connect the two? And they're so different. You know, when you see society as behaving a certain way, you sort of follow along like a herd. But then when you as an individual are about to buy that single-use plastic water bottle, it's like, I'm just one person, it doesn't really matter. How is it that we behave like this?
Well,
We
I
may have
think
a little
we often
connection
don't
issue
think about
here.
it, right? I
Let's
mean,
see.
we have our society set up in such a way. Okay, are we back? I think we're back. Yeah, it was breaking up for a little bit, but I think I got the gist of your question. I mean, I would say, you know, we often don't think about it because it's not just norms, it's just that our institutions aren't set up for it, you know. If, you know, a lot of times if you want to see some major significant change in society, you need to revise the institutions. You know, yeah, we don't think a lot about how much bottled water we consume. I think that's changing. You know, I think a lot of people weren't thinking about the small everyday things like straw usage, and I think that's also changing in some ways too. But it's difficult to consider. I mean, do we want to think about that as an endpoint, or do we want to think about that as a symbolic starting point, right? And I think you would agree, and I think a lot would agree, right? Like banning straws is something, but it's a trivial contribution to the, you know, to the amount of global plastic pollution that's out there. But I think it's a great symbolic aspect of something that we don't even think about, that makes us think about all the different other plastics that we're constantly consuming. And I think it does. It raises huge amounts of awareness about the other kinds of things that we need to be revising and changing, and the ways that we could be lobbying and building organization around this. And again, it's not just about any one fight, although one fight can get a lot of people involved. It's really about how you can build long-term durable organization. And I think that's the story of a lot of successful social movements, is turning, you know, the language we often use is moments to movements, right? You have a moment that's highly publicized. How do you get that and turn it into something durable? And in our social media environment today, I would say you have a lot of opportunities for moments. Everyone's after their sort of influencer, so to speak, moments, right?
Yes.
And sometimes those have huge consequence. I mean, think about the Ice Bucket Challenge. You know, I mean, that raised an enormous amount of money for ALS. And it showed that health-based social movement organizations and patient advocacy groups can find all kinds of ways. If you can have that vivid moment of getting people involved, that can really help to make a significant difference. The thing is, how do you turn that individual moment that might get a huge amount of publicity and make that into something more substantial? And that's the trick.
Right.
It's the comparatively unsexy stuff that happens in chapter-based organizing that I think can ultimately make more of a difference than the big moment that everyone pays attention to, whether it's, you know, the Ice Bucket Challenge or, you know, Coney 2012 or whatever the viral political moment might be.
We have a question that just came in. It says airlines in Europe have applied for 12.8 billion euros government support without environmental conditions attached. It's very disappointing how awareness reflection can turn into action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, I mean, we can think about all kinds of different ways of trying to organize that can have a really substantial impact. You know, even though, I mean, take another example from European policy that went in a much different way, which is the GDPR, which added all kinds of new privacy restrictions. I think all of us received emails from just about every company we've ever interacted with a year, all saying that, you know, the European Union had updated its privacy policies. Now, think about that. I mean, it wasn't just an important moment for changing privacy policies and getting us to maybe read, probably not, those terms and conditions that you all just click accept to. But what that did was actually significantly empowered the privacy movement, a really substantial impact, and got people thinking about, how much of my data is being given away at all moments that I don't even think about, not just with terms of service, but with cookies, with apps. I mean, the security people always say, your phone's only as secure as the, most crappy app that you have on there that could be selling your data. And I think we're much more aware of those things because of some of these privacy laws. And so again, it's one of those institutional changes that can lead to kind of individual change. And I think that's a lot of what we're hoping for in the environmental space as well, even if all policy battles don't always go that way.
And then the other question we had, thank you for that, was from a student that says, how can a young student get involved in making a social movement? This is a high school student that's asking. Are there some tips you can offer someone that's younger that wants to make a change?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think youth movements are an incredibly important and vital source of social change. We're seeing this now around climate with the Sunrise Movement. I mean, I think it's difficult at this moment, right? I mean, we don't know what things are going to look like even a few days to weeks from now, given everything surrounding COVID-19. But that doesn't mean organizing needs to stop. That doesn't mean that people can't continue to be involved in some really significant ways. And after this, I can send around some articles to anyone who's interested. Or if you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at Edward Walker, and I can shoot back some articles and things that have been writing about this. But I mean, I think it's something that's really important to be aware of right now. Is that I hate the term social distancing. I just hate it.
I know
because,
it should be physical.
And actually, well, it's physical distancing. That's right. And actually, a group of our colleagues in the UCLA Sociology department, it was a collective document that our whole faculty wrote up, led by Cecilia Menjivar, Jacob Foster, and Jenny Brand, that was posted on CNN. Is trying to get us to do away with this term social distancing. We really need to think about it.
I saw that and I reposted. I love that.
I mean, it's physical distancing. We need social support right now. We need not just to be looking out for our neighbors, especially elderly folks, but we also need to be looking out for each other and finding new ways to organize. And I'd say that's happening. I mean, there are a lot of efforts to do that. There was a piece in The Guardian the other day that cataloged a wide range of different things that are happening. We saw a protest in Israel that was formally physically distanced. I almost caught myself saying that again. Where they actually had X mark the spot 6 feet apart from each other, where people could stand and actually have public demonstrations. Not sure that's a perfect solution, but people are trying to find ways to do this, and I think it's really important that we not stop trying to make the social change we want, because I mean, other people are doing this. I mean, Trump's EPA has said that it's not going to enforce all kinds of EPA actions during this time. People in power will not let a crisis go to waste. So the people who want to change the system shouldn't let it go to waste either.
Sounds like you and your department jumped into a social movement.
Well, I think we were all mobilized by the moment, and the social psychologist who I know Adam Grant at Wharton has been talking about how important it is at this moment to be involved in various kinds of helping behaviors, and I think that's so true. We're all trying to find our way through this very difficult time, and I think the more that we help each other out and build new kinds of community that reflect this moment and help us to get past it as a community, maybe if not a community that involves a lot of face-to-face interaction, I think is so important right now, not just for the kind of structures that it builds and the ways that it can develop social change, but also for our own well-being. I think we all need to be looking out for each other, and that was part of what we wanted to advocate in that piece.
So I'm going to jump back into plastic pollution, because this to me is something that is so fascinating. I just found it to be so bizarre that suddenly we have this dependency on, for example, the plastic water bottle, where we're discarding 1 million plastic bottles per minute. And if you look in film, there's a lot of plastics that you see on camera, which are basically affecting societal behavior, if you ask me. And then also, I studied a little bit more about where did this come from? How did this normal concept of always having a water bottle at arm's length begin even? And it started out in New York Fashion Week with the models carrying plastic water bottles, and it just became this cool factor. And of course, they've got multi-million-dollar budgets to convince all of us that plastic water bottles are better and our tap water is not. And yesterday we had Dr. Shapiro on, who was basically proving to us that plastic water bottles and filter tap are the same, if not filter tap is better. So here we are as a society not believing this anymore. And at what, how do we undo all of this is what I'm trying to understand. Are we on the right path? I mean, all these organizations that, we work with, and all these people are, screaming at the rooftops saying, we're destroying our planet. There's only 9% being recycled. What can we do to make it better? Is there anything else? I mean, talk about mobilizing. I mean, these are organizations we're just a tiny one, but they're multi-million-dollar budgets and stuff. So how do we undo this big mess that has been created for us?
Sure. I mean, I think it comes back to the point that we were discussing a little bit earlier about individual change versus institutional change. And I do think that, a little bit of sort of soft shaming of your friends and so on can make some kind of difference. But I think a lot of the other aspects of it are really important to consider. I mean, think about how airports now all have the sort of, water dispensers that come down from the top. That people might be a little bit more comfortable with, and I think that those kinds of things. I mean, to the extent that people start bringing their own collapsible water bottles to the airport, that's just one of those small things that I think has the potential to be a much more significant source of social change, where a lot of our daily built-in behaviors are based around what the built environment around us is like. And I mean, to the extent that you have, easy access to that, and people get over, whatever unfounded fears they have about tap water and so on, I think those kinds of things can be a really significant social change. But I don't think it's entirely either or. It's not just about only institutional change versus how do you get the individuals to care about it. It's about bringing those two things together. If you know that you're the only one of your friends who tends to have bottled water around, that might be something that you start to notice after a while. I do think that the social norms piece can make a difference. But what I understand, though, from lots of research in public health, is that, social norms campaigns, like advertising around social norms campaigns, usually aren't that effective of a behavior change strategy. So, you see these ads that talk about safe sex practices around college campuses. You see things that try to get people to smoke less or to do less of various kinds of behaviors that are harmful to their health. And you might see something out, with an ad saying, statistic like, 9 out of 10 people don't do X risky behavior. And maybe, if you're one of those people in that 10, the idea is that that would make you change your behavior. There's not a whole lot of really strong evidence that that actually makes a huge difference. Maybe the interpersonal interactions might matter a little bit more. So if you hear something directly from a friend, that might actually move your behavior a little bit more. I think, if you really want to move the needle, you really have to talk about how you change the broader social institutions and change the way the society is set up as a whole.
It's just interesting because if you think about it, back in the day, people said, oh God, Evian company is crazy. They're actually going to try and charge us for water in a plastic bottle. Like, what are they thinking? Yeah. And yet slowly but surely they convinced everybody that this is the way and this is better for you and you'll be more beautiful and all that. So I think the combination of marketing to us the way that they have been and what goes on screen and what we constantly, the nuance once again of what you think is cool and beautiful, and it just suddenly starts to stick before you even realize what's happened. So I think that that's kind of the scary and sad part, is getting bad habits in are so much easier than undoing them. Yeah.
But don't you think that, I mean, I'm curious, I have a question for you. I mean, don't you think a lot of that's changed in the last few years, that it's now seen as a little bit, less fashionable to be consuming bottled water than it used to be? Now, I don't know, I don't think that's made its way all the way down through our whole society.
No, I was going to say, maybe in LA.
Yeah. Well, right. Yeah, right. But
we have a question.
I'd be curious. Yeah, right.
We have a question for you. It says, Dr. Walker, do you feel we could and should change the message regarding plastic waste or sustainable living? I often feel that the public are fatigued from the repeated message and turn off.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's an old slogan in political organizing that goes back to the community organizer Saul Alinsky, and he has this great line. He says, the action's in the reaction. And what he meant by that was, you can't really know what kind of change you're going to make unless you start pushing. And if you stop pushing, nothing's ever going to change. And so what you need to do is keep pushing and keep trying to build up those 4 things I talked about, right? Communication, organization, power and analysis of power, and authenticity, right? If you could bring those 4 things together and keep consistently pushing, you have a much better chance of making change. If you don't push at all, nothing's ever going to change.
Yeah, don't
You
give
know,
up,
the
basically.
powers that be in any institutional setting are that's right, never give up. Always keep pushing because again, the action's in the reaction. You can't know what's going to happen until you start pushing.
That's true. Dr. Walker, we're so happy and proud to have you on our advisory board, and we appreciate that you're able to give us your feedback on ideas that come up in the future and now, and being with us for this past 30 minutes. If there's anything else that we haven't asked that you'd like to touch on, by all means, please share. And also, maybe you might want to put in a plug for your book that I think is so cool too.
Oh, thank you. Sure. Yeah. Well, so thank you so much, Sheila, for doing this and for all the work that your organization is doing. I mean, more than anything else, I just hope people are taking care of themselves. I mean, this is a scary time for everyone. And, you know, I think we need to be, you know, worrying about making lots of social changes in the world, but also looking out for ourselves and looking out for your families and communities. So I really hope everyone's doing that. So yeah, I mean, just briefly, I mean, my book is called Grassroots for Hire. It's about the way that companies and industry groups mobilize public participation. Has a lot to say about this distinction between grassroots participation and what sometimes gets called AstroTurf. And of course, there's been a huge amount of discussion about this lately, given everything that's been happening around the reopen protests that have been happening from the far right in our country in the last few weeks. And so, you know, if you're interested in those kinds of topics, or if you're interested in political organizing more generally, I've written lots of things. I've been studying the anti-fracking movement quite a lot lately, for those of you who are interested in that, and studying a lot around shareholder activism to try to get companies to change their practices that way too. So yeah, so please, look for me on Twitter, Edward Walker, and if you're at UCLA, come by and say hi sometime once things reopen, once they do.
Well,
But thank
thank
you
you
again, Sheila.
again.
It was
This
great.
was wonderful, as always. It's so interesting to talk with you. And this will be up on, on our stories for the next 24 hours. So if you guys just joined in, please take a look at it in a few. This was fascinating, and I love COPA. That is going to be my motto, and I'm going to print it huge on my wall, and I will continue watching it. And moment to movement. I love that too. So many great takeaways. Thank you again for teaching us and guiding us. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe.
You too. Thanks so much, Sheila.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Be well. Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.